What's up, guys, and welcome back to another showcase of brand new survival horror titles. 4 words that I truly never thought I'd be able to use in that order ever again. If you're new to this whole deal, the idea here is to give you guys a quick look at the current crop of what I like to call RE clones. And counterintuitively, not every game in this video is going to play exactly like a Resident Evil title, but each one is going to have significant elements that could be traced back to one, or at the very least, one of the games that RE inspired. Now, I know the term clone can have some negative associations, but I promise it's just a blanket phrase to ensure we're all on the same page. And, it does make for a snappy little title. Alright, so now that we're all caught up, what do you say we check out what I think is the most interesting and exciting collection I put together so far? What's up, everyone? I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews. Alright, so I'm gonna have to work fast with this one because it was an incredibly short demo that left me with only a few precious minutes of footage. And with that in mind, Aether Singularity is basically the answer to the question, what if Squaresoft decided to make a survival horror inspired game in the late 90s, but it wasn't Parasite Eve? I mean, look at this thing. It screams late stage PS1 graphics, and the character designs are just wholesomely nostalgic. Look at this face. This is something akin to what we'd see in a game like Vagrant Story. Which means these guys obviously know full well how to recreate a very specific era of disc-based console graphics, and I am all here for it. The demons you come up against carry over the same exact aptitude. They look relatively simplistic, maybe a little less complex than what you might find in Parasite Eve, but stylistically resemble more an enemy from FF7 with their mostly untextured colored polygons. Alright, listen, I don't have time to really get into it, but let's just say this is the best looking game in terms of style that I've ever seen chase that PS1 aesthetic. I mean, from the 3D models and fixed camera angles to the character portraits, this thing just oozes late 90s Japanese game dev. But enough gloating over graphics. The story is a kind of what-if scenario that has the internet being discovered in 1969, only it's essentially what sci-fi writers of the era would have assumed it was. A global network that allowed demons to enter into the real world and wreak havoc. So the FBI starts a team called Data that works with friendly demons to take out the hostile ones. It's a story that I and other SMT fans are already gonna love, and the brief glimpse that I got through this demo has me drooling for more. Oh, and a big shout out to the glitch that had my main character Leo stuck in the reload position for the last 2 cutscenes. Gameplay-wise, you wander around using tank controls and my beloved fixed camera angles while getting into non-random encounters. The combat, to me at least, feels very familiar despite me never really playing anything like this before. Maybe it's the Parasite Eve-like perspective it's rocking, but regardless, you've got a gun and magic spells, so what more do you need to know? You build up meter for your spells by landing regular hits, and while dodging attacks can be hard work with tank controls, you're given a cool little preview of where incoming attacks will be coming from and what direction they'll be headed in. You've also got this dodge move that'll shoot you back a few steps in whatever direction you want. It's honestly a simple system, but it works incredibly well, and like the story, I really can't wait to see what else it might have in store for me with the finished game. Speaking of which, you can plow through this demo in maybe 10 or 15 minutes, which is disappointing because I wanted way more than that, but you can also unlock a cool VR mission looking challenge mode that'll give you maybe another 10 minutes or so to mess with the combat. To put this very bluntly, this is the most excited I have been for a game release since I started this series. I don't know if it's the look, the gameplay, or the general late 90s Squaresoft aura it's emanating, but I am positively wild about being able to play this as a full release. My one and only criticism is that the developers are only planning on making the finished product a 30 to 60 minute affair, and I can already tell you I'm gonna want to play this game way more than that. Honestly, I don't really know what this kind of title can be called. I mean, it has elements of survival horror in it, but it's definitely not that, while at the same time, it feels equally like and not like an RPG. Regardless, I do know one thing. I want more of whatever this is. Right up front, I'm going to go ahead and admit that Raging Bytes by Hitpoint isn't even in the same zip code as the survival horror genre in any functional way, and neither is it anywhere near Resident Evil in terms of gameplay. It is, however, a retro-inspired 2D turn-based RPG set in a zombie apocalypse, and I'll be damned if I'm not going to mention something that unbelievably cool here in this series. And besides, it's very obviously inspired by all the same zombie movies that Resident Evil was an homage to, so I'm sure we can make some kind of a flimsy video essay tier argument here. Somehow adding another layer of coolness though, I actually came across the demo for this game at Tokyo Game Show when I first moved to Japan. Its Japanese title was a very interesting Zombie of the Dot, and I remember keeping footage of me playing it around because I wanted to remember to check up on it periodically. And well, I didn't. Or at least I didn't right up until about a week ago when my buddy Doug from South Florida texted me that he had just pre-ordered a game that I might get into, and there it was. That zombie title I was supposed to remember, and as a lucky break, it had been out on Steam for about a year now. And after putting a meager 4 hours into it, I can tell you right now, I have fallen in love with it. Now, interestingly, the game starts out with a pretty serious story, which was surprising because its cutesy demeanor had me expecting more of a comical satire. The intro uses a nice little family interaction as an exposition device to let us all know that the country is currently wrapped up in the drama of what's called the Saturn Project, which unintuitively is a mission to bring back materials from the moon and not Saturn. It was apparently a success though, and its crew has been suspiciously hidden away from the media while they quote-unquote rest. From there, we're taken to a reporter on her day off as she finds out about the outbreak of a newly discovered disease. Suddenly, a friend of hers bursts in and lets her know that people are turning into zombies all over the city and they need to get the hell out of there. Then we jump to a few weeks after those events to a cop named Ben who was hit by a car and has been in a coma for exactly 28 days. Yeah, I should probably go ahead and point out that nearly every line of dialogue in this game is going to contain some sort of homage to zombie media up to and including our main characters' names. Like I said earlier though, the game actually plays a lot of this straight. It does dip into comedy at times, but for the most part, the drama of people trying to survive a zombie apocalypse, distrust, lawlessness, and looters is treated relatively seriously. There is, of course, a certain level of camp included, and it can be very derivative, but I mean, what are you gonna do? These are chibi sprites acting out these dramatic events. That is kind of to be expected. And besides, if you are inspired by zombie movies, you are, to some degree, inspired by campiness inherently. Heading into the gameplay though, we've got something incredibly interesting going on. As you navigate the zombie-filled streets of major cities or the interiors of infested buildings, you're obviously going to come up against hordes of the undead, and like any Z-flick worth its weight in gore, the age-old rule of weak individually but strong in groups applies here. Coming into contact with one of these things will trigger a turn-based encounter where the name of the game is efficient use of those turns. The opposing zombie will be some distance away from you and they'll have to use a number of their turns to actually get close enough to strike. So you're obviously going to want to use long-range attacks until they get in your face enough to utilize melee options, but there's a twist. You're going to want to conserve ammunition as much as possible. You will eventually come across things like throwing knives, which will keep you from digging into your precious bullets, but until then our guy Ben has a special ability that'll let him throw rocks for long-range damage. But more interestingly, B, once the zombie does get in close, using a melee weapon against them and not dealing a lethal blow will actually result in a bit of damage splashback on the attacking party member. Each weapon is going to offer differing levels of resulting player damage and knockback, but the general idea is to weaken a deadhead enough so that when they do get in your face, your melee strike kills them, which will negate any splashback damage. At first, when you only have one or two party members and haven't come across the real good weapons yet, this can be a very simple and admittedly repetitive system, but once you do add to both your roster of characters and weapons, it becomes a really strategy-heavy affair. Dealing with groups is going to have you prioritizing enemies based on how close they're getting or whether or not they have the ability to attack you from long range, and the guns you start coming across will get more interesting mechanics like using different ammo types or attacking more than one bad guy randomly. It's an RPG combat system that I started off just sort of liking, but eventually grew to love once it started to hit its stride. And there's a pretty cool mechanic tied to the act of starting one of these fights too. As you run around aggroing zombies, they'll obviously give chase. The ones that are aware of your presence will have an exclamation mark over their heads, and if you get into an encounter at this point, any zombie that knows you're there will show up for the fight. So a good method is sneaking around, taking out single Zeds without alerting the ones around them, and in the spirit of survival horror, just running around like a madman and avoiding combat altogether is an available strat most of the time. To encourage exploration off the beaten path, you'll get rewards for examining the environment and fallen zombies, so sometimes it's worth the effort to blow through a tough area just to see if there's a pile of bullets in it for you. Being totally honest, this is not the most difficult game in the world, mostly thanks to the fact that you can use healing items without using up a turn, and those things are given out like candy. But as you start coming across stronger zombies and bigger groups, just avoiding damage and efficiently using resources becomes its own sort of difficulty. And speaking of which, it would be very difficult to not comment on how beautiful this game looks. The sprite art for characters is almost necessarily simplistic given the style they're chasing, but there's a good amount of detail in there as well. Outside of that though, your environment is what really steals the show. They populate each area with all kinds of little details that you'd want to see in a spot recently flooded by the living dead. There's blood all over the place, human body parts scattered around, and evidence that people made efforts to keep the zombies out. And just look at the beauty that is this inventory screen. I mean, damn, actual real-life perfection. In battle, you can tell the zombie sprites are actually several different sprites being animated individually, which is a really cool effect and allows for movement that's a little more dynamic than what would normally be possible. And this might only matter to me, but we finally get to see a developer fully commit to the low-res 2D look by actually using a sprite sheet for its fonts, meaning its words look just as sharp as the graphics around them and are subject to the same type of scaling. I do, however, have a few complaints though. This weird filter that they apply to the screen when you're not in battle only serves to soften the picture, and the weird attempt at a chromatic aberration with this pink shadow doesn't work very well in my opinion. And since we are complaining, it would be nice if there was an option in battle to just burn one of your turns. For example, early in the game, Ben's going to be throwing rocks almost exclusively, and if you want to conserve ammo, you won't be shooting with Barbara. So instead, you'll have to just heal someone that probably doesn't need it to end her turn without using an item or taking a shot. I think an end turn button would do a lot to make this game feel a little more polished. And finally, you have the ability to save at any time, anywhere, on top of the pretty zealous system of autosaves for every time you get an item or reach a checkpoint. What I'm trying to say is, it would be nice if the stakes were a little higher for failure. That way the game wouldn't feel quite so easy. I mean, I know they weren't going for a survival horror feel, but a bit of challenge can help an RPG just as much as a Resident Evil game. Aside from those dumb complaints though, this is one of my favorite games I played this year. It's just such a killer idea, and it's executed with what I would call tactical precision. As a guy who appreciates zombie movies and JRPGs as much as I do, it's awesome to see those two worlds coming together so smoothly. It's essentially a George Romero version of Final Fantasy, and the fact that I could say something like that even exists gets me all giddy inside, which very well may be the first time I've ever in my life referred to myself as being giddy. And to be totally honest, this is exactly what I was hoping Resident Evil Gaiden on the Game Boy Color would have been. But Capcom's missed opportunities aside, Raging Bytes is wildly fun and an absolute joy to play through. It's only $20 on Steam, and with the value I've already gotten out of it, I can recommend paying that a few times over. Whatever you do, please, try this game out. If you guys will allow me to break with the format for a second, I'd like to shout out one of the more awesome projects I've encountered in a very long time. Because as a seasoned metalhead and a celebrated enjoyer of survival horror, it would be flat out immoral for me not to let you know about Restless Dreams, a Silent Hill 2 black metal cover album. And if I know my audience as well as I think I do, I would say there's a good chunk of you that dropped whatever you were doing and perked an ear to that combination of words. This EP was recorded by Corey Parks of the black and thrash band Grave Ripper, and as you can probably hear right now, it absolutely kills. According to Corey, the album's set to go live October 8th, right along Silent Hill 2 Remake, and if I know my slow ass, this video is probably going to come out pretty near that release date. I'll have a link to the project's Bandcamp page in the description for those of you interested in pre-ordering it, and to be honest, you should be. The combination of tremolo pick guitars, melodic riffs, and blast beats fit Yamaoka's original tunes so well it's actually kind of insane. So to summarize all this, Silent Hill 2, black metal, October 8th release date, and this poorly photoshopped image I made of James Sunderland in corpse paint. I think that should just about cover everything, so let's get back to the games. Becrowned from 13th Street Studios is yet another project I've been watching very closely on social media. I'm not really sure I'd seen more than a few still images and some concept stuff in motion before actually playing it, but it looked to me like the kind of game that and I assume you guys would really get a kick out of. And in some kind of a lucky twist of fate, as I started work on this video, its developer announced on Twitter that a demo would be coming out right about when you'll be hearing these words. So I opened up my DMs at light speed to see if I could potentially get an early look at it, and the guy had already messaged me with that exact offer thanks to a mutual buddy passing my name along. So if you are indeed watching this and still conscious, head over to Becrowned's Steam page and snag its newly released free demo. Before we even get into specifics, I can already say that I really recommend it. Story-wise, at least as far as this demo is concerned, I can't really tell you that there's a whole picture represented here, only glimpses of one, and it seems to be following a more psychological thriller type of direction, which is a personal favorite. Your main character essentially wakes up in an elevator and ends up in an asylum. As you explore, it seems like his war vet father spent a good bit of time in this place or somewhere like it, and he understandably wasn't exactly happy about that. Outside of that, there seems to be a lot of religious or religion-adjacent iconography, which goes along very nicely with the overwhelmingly Silent Hill-feeling influences everywhere else. The design of the environment is both recognizably normal and disturbing, and I love it both functionally and visually. It's less of that Resident Evil style of depicting a contemporary place just after an apocalyptic event, and more like a Silent Hill style environment, which is like a modern location that's been smashed together with some unearthly Hellraiser dimension. At first, I started playing the demo with the controller, but I could only use my DualSense's analog sticks for movement, which never feels good with tank controls. On top of that, I wasn't able to find any button that would let me run, so the first maybe 20 minutes of footage that I captured was me just sort of walking around. Eventually, I decided to try the keyboard and mouse controls since they are sort of recommended when you start the game, and I would say this is probably the best way to play the demo. I know it might seem kind of weird at first to use tank controls on a keyboard, but oddly enough, they feel really natural there. And I can actually run with this setup, which was an appreciated improvement. Now, to be totally fair, I didn't test out an Xbox controller, and it does seem like a lot of indie devs tend to target that specific hardware when they include controller support, so there is a chance I just picked the wrong brand, but either way, I'd still go with the keyboard controls if I were you. And on a somewhat related note, Becrowned's camera also looks to SH when it comes to operation, and I would say it works great like 90% of the time. If you end up fighting somewhere limited like a hallway, the camera's set just a little too low, which allows your character to block your view of what the enemy's up to, and it makes for some really bad depth perception. I feel like this would be a pretty easily remedied issue with just a slight adjustment, like having the camera lift up and focus over a certain shoulder when the ready button's held down. On that same note, during the demo's boss fight, I found that I had a hard time getting the camera to actually look at the guy I was trying to shoot, which was a pretty big issue because I would need to hit him once and then get out of the way of his counterattack. Otherwise, I think the camera does a really good job during the moment-to-moment exploration, which, to be honest, is going to take up the majority of your playtime. I've always been a big fan of this kind of Silent Hill-style dynamic camera system, and even though I can admit it's probably not the most effective from a purely gameplay-driven sense, it's always made exploration look really sharp. Speaking of which, while exploring the asylum, you can expect your average survival horror game beats, item hunting, exploration, and puzzle solving, and I can assure you all of them feel very refined. But since the game is definitely trying to occupy more of that Silent Hill side of the spectrum, you're not going to have to worry about item conservation, inventory management, or limited saves. I'd say combat is probably the least polished feature in the demo, but it's still not what I would call bad. Enemy animations make it fairly easy to read when they're getting an attack ready, which makes it easy enough to get out of the way, especially when you're in an area that allows you to circle around them. That being said, I think your character's attack animations with melee weapons can be a little tight and stilted. It sort of feels like he should be extending his arms or moving a little bit more, so it looks more like a swing and less like a tiny little poke. Guns work just about as well as you might expect, with the only issue that I found being that I couldn't seem to reload them either inside or outside of the menu unless I just ran out of ammo and hit the fire button again. This being the type of game it is though, I of course attempted to conserve ammo by running away from more than a few fights, and I'm happy to report back that that is a viable strategy here. I'd say the puzzles were satisfyingly difficult, but not so hard that you'd need to look for a guide or anything. Most solutions can be found either somewhere in your notes or in your environment, so if you're already used to playing survival horror games, you're going to have no issues with these. All in all though, the game's most striking feature as far as I'm concerned is its presentation. Most indie games nowadays are targeting specific console video output, like a PS1 or 2, but it feels like Becrowned is going for a more generalized, low-res look. If anything, it kind of feels like a PC port of a console game played on a much higher-end display than it was meant to run on. The developer seems to have an affinity for a low bit depth, which means you're going to see a lot of color banding, which is something I didn't know I had nostalgia for until I saw it here. And the lights are getting a lot of attention too, with these very cool looking coronas and halos interacting nicely with the low internal resolution. On top of that, there are some parts of the environment that are genuinely pitch black, and seeing the flashlight only just barely illuminate these creepy ass locations is a very cool effect. The only artifacting that I would say doesn't come across as a purposeful effect is your main character's shirt. It seems like the low resolution and the static effect is making it seem smooth in some areas and textured in others, which is something I couldn't stop looking at. Aside from that though, this thing is a visual smoke show. Really great designs that are both cool to look at and carry over that Silent Hill trait of seeming like there's some deeper philosophical meaning to the stuff you're seeing. I'm really liking this new switch from Resident Evil clones to SH clones, and like I said before, this is a demo you're definitely going to want to check out. It feels unique as hell in this current crop of indie horror games and offers up that psychological terror that we don't get to see all that often. And besides that, there's something to be said for the dedication its developer is already showing. There were a few bugs that I came across while getting footage, and after I mentioned them to him, they were patched out almost immediately. So if you do run into any issues, I would imagine they've got a very good chance of being addressed pretty fast. And since all of us here on the internet are rightly prone to calling out devs for bad practices, it only seems fair that we do the same when the opposite's going on.
Only a few brave souls dare to take back their city. Dinner time.
Alright, so I assume we all know about Dino Crisis. You know, Resident Evil mixed with Jurassic Park and just a pinch of, that's disgusting. It's a series that wasn't exactly popular, but was well loved and sort of blew its brains out in the form of its third entry, to the point where Capcom doesn't want anything to do with it anymore. And you can call Capcom a lot of names, but inconsistent is not one of them. You give them an opportunity to make the right decision, and they won't do it every single time, guaranteed. Which means there's a whole lot of people looking for that specific combination of dinosaurs and survival horror, and they certainly aren't getting it from any of the more AAA sources. So like we always do in this kind of scenario, we look to the independent game scene for our fix, and we find Dino Break, a survival horror title developed by Dead Drop Studios. After starting the game up, we get a nice little nostalgic content warning still screen and an absolutely staggering amount of options. But after navigating the multiple choice quiz necessary for beginning a new game, we're met with a text crawl explaining that scientists were looking to cure a bunch of diseases, but instead brought the dinosaurs back. Which, to be honest, is an understandable mix-up, all things considered. And I think most people are probably going to have a decent idea of what we're about to come up against when first hearing what I have to assume is a story written by someone not very familiar with the English language.
None the wiser to what would wait for them the next morning. Eggs.
But on the plus side, none of this is really all that important. All you really need to know is that you're this girl, and your goal is to play as much of this game as you can physically stand. Pretty negative right off the bat, I know, but in my defense, I didn't really have the best first impression with Dino Break. While navigating the wildly dense set of options for starting a new game, I must have missed this one right here, and for a good long while I was playing an over-the-shoulder shooter with some of the worst controls I've ever experienced. And it's hard to get stuff like this across in a non-interactive medium like a video, but there's almost too much wrong here for me to even know where to start. When you begin moving, there's some kind of momentum involved, so you aren't going to be taking off very quickly, and the default dual stick method just felt awful to me. I played a good portion of the game this way until in a fight I accidentally pressed in the right thumbstick and found out the game supports several perspectives. So with this new information under my belt, I started a new game with the fixed camera and tank controls that I would imagine was the developer intended way to play. And in fairness, it definitely felt much better. I mean, it didn't outright get rid of all the jank, and the whole momentum thing was still annoying as hell, but the game felt much more polished, at least by comparison. Everything from aiming my weapon to navigation was much smoother and felt like something approaching a finished product. It was actually kind of interesting because at first I flat out hated this game. It felt frustratingly poorly made and incredibly inconsistent, but after starting the game in what I can only call survival horror mode, it seemed to flow much better for me. I mean, honestly, 85% of the bad stuff was still there, but I found the act of getting from one place to another and item hunting to be much more enjoyable. Like I was hinting at before, it's still not what I would call a good game, but it was a very noticeable improvement. As you explore the city in the way the good Lord intended, that being with fixed camera positions, the game introduces these dino eggs as a mechanic where if you shoot or touch one, an enemy will come flying out, which is actually a kind of nice touch, if not a bit annoying when you use the handgun with a piercing effect. When one of these eggs do burst open, or you just run into a dinosaur in the street, you're going to have to engage in some pretty stereotypical survival horror combat, which means holding a shoulder button and using another one to fire, and I would say a good majority of my issues lie here. Now, I haven't fully gotten this thing figured out yet, but it seems like your first shot will almost always down the enemy temporarily, so you might think after it gets up that the next time it goes to the ground it's actually dead, but oh how stupid you would be. These guys can hit the ground 4 or more times after this and still get back up again, so the main strat of choice is to keep shooting until blood stops coming out of their body. Oh, and they will always stand back up for a second to execute their death animation, so you're going to want to look out for that to keep from wasting too much ammo. Once you nail that down, fights can be a little less punishing, but it's still miles away from feeling good. Sometimes your shots will keep a dino from attacking when it's in range, or sometimes they'll just tank your hits and deliver an attack as you're removing their face with bullets. Oh, and it seems randomly regular enemies can just poison you, which is about as fun as a poison mechanic has ever been in any game. Now on the plus side, Dino Break is nice enough to keep you filled to the brim with healing items and ammo, so things definitely could be worse, but I was just never able to get this thing to feel good in my hands. And continuing down this long road of complaints, the voice acting in the intro was actually some of the best you'll come across, as the rest sounds like this.
Someone welded the entire thing shut.
Well, we can't head back up to the street. Those creatures are everywhere.
We're beyond fucked.
Now, when I really think about it, I guess I'm not totally against the idea of using AI for voiceovers in games with such a low budget or realistically none at all, but I can definitely tell you we're not at a point where it sounds good enough to warrant not just asking some of the developers to provide voices for the game, or hell, even voice actors who are looking to get a name in the scene and offering free work. I mean, I don't really know if that's a thing, but it sounds like it would be. I think you guys can tell that Dino Break annoyed the absolute hell out of me, and it's very clear that the game's other perspectives were added in after it had been optimized for a fixed one, so both the first and third person modes feel wildly nasty. And I'm saying all of this because, and I understand if you don't believe me, but at some point I did start feeling something approximating enjoyment. I mean, before I continue, it is important to say that this game feels about as close to unfinished as you can get without actually not finishing your game, but I'll be damned if it didn't have at least a bit of charm to it. After restarting for the second time because I got to this part right here and had no way of getting past it, I found the exploration and key hunting to be relatively intuitive. The layout of the streets and tunnels were fairly well done, and at the risk of praising these guys, they were able to stuff in an absolute buttload of familiar genre mechanics. I mean, we've got this weapon durability system that requires guns to be sporadically tuned up to keep them from breaking. Then there's gunpowder mixing, weapon upgrades, the ability to drop items where you're standing and pick them back up again, which is useful as all hell when you need to mix an herb but are rocking a full inventory. And you know, I'll admit the soundtrack is surprisingly appropriate as well. There really is a lot here, and I think in better hands this could have easily been something much more professional feeling. As it stands though, I can't really in good conscience recommend anyone check out Dino Break. I mean, I did start to have fun with it, and the puzzles were honestly fairly good, the few that I came across, but the entire time I was fighting against the game to enjoy it, and I would imagine I wouldn't have gotten to that point if I wasn't looking to capture a lot of footage because I planned on complaining about this thing for a very long time. But as I was doing research for this script, I found out that Dino Break is actually part of some indie dev extended universe. There's a pretty surprising number of titles in this Outbreak series, and since Dino Break did supply the tiniest molecule of fun for me, I decided to dive into this library and see what else they had to offer. I knew it was likely to be a bad idea, but you never know. Maybe Dino Break was a one-off and I was actually missing out on some sleeper survival horror dynasty. I mean, we both know that that's not the case, but hey, you got anything better to do? Yeah, neither do I, so let's dive in. I first started out with what seems to be the progenitor to all this, the original Outbreak. A game that had my interest at first, but as I started it, I quickly got the feeling that it was made with multiplayer more in mind than survival horror. And in the game's defense, once I was able to navigate the incredibly unintuitive menus to actually get a single-player campaign going, it did kind of resemble a survival horror game if you looked at it the right way. To be totally honest though, I think I played Newgrounds era Flash titles that handled the genre just about as well. This was a game that I didn't exactly hate, but its awkward controls, RPG Maker sort of look, and lack of anything that really grabbed me made me quit out as soon as I died first. Now maybe it's a different story when you've got a few friends together for one of its multiplayer scenarios, but as far as I'm concerned, there just wasn't enough here to keep me playing apart from a kind of cool looking flashlight effect.
Thank goodness. You're awake. We could really use some help.
Continuing down the rabbit hole that is Dead Drop Studios' library, I found an almost yearly release roster, all of which seemingly get built off of a shared pool of ideas and assets. After the first Outbreak came Outbreak the New Nightmare, which kept the multiplayer focus of the original top-down entry, so I decided to skip that one, which led me to Outbreak Nightmare Chronicles, something that looked more like it was up my alley, but also smelled to me like an absolute mess going purely off the game's trailer. I mean, these guys were definitely headed in the right direction, but I was looking for something at least on par with what I'd seen in Dino Break, so I skipped over 2 more co-op entries in the series and arrived at Outbreak Contagious Memories, the game that preceded the aforementioned dinosaur title. And in a twist I don't think anyone's going to be surprised by, Dino Break was essentially an asset flip of this game. The environments, dumb AI voice acting, controls, inventory, everything. Only now the combat works even worse, if you can imagine that, because the fire speed's been reduced to an annoying degree. I will say that once again, the music is pretty okay here, and I did see the beginnings of a project that halfway knew what it wanted to be, but with all due respect for the developers, they just did not have it in them to deliver a polished enough product for me to want to play past my first death. Once again. So I guess thanks for joining me down what started as a game review but then turned into an entire developer deep dive. It probably goes without saying, but I cannot recommend any of the games I looked at here in this section. Like I touched on before, there is a spark of survival horror somewhere inside these titles, but it just isn't able to shine bright enough to distract me from the either low budget, lack of game dev experience, or both. Zero Below the Sun is, well, it's a few different things. Its developer Black Curtain Studios calls it an action-adventure game in the Steam tags, but its description leans more on the words survival and horror. And listen, we've all heard me piss and moan on that subject enough for several lifetimes, so why don't we just meet in the middle with the term modern survival horror? That being said, like I mentioned seconds ago, this is a multivariate subject. With a cursory look at some gameplay, you might like me assume that the devs were aiming squarely for RE4 when they made it a third-person shooter with a just barely over-the-shoulder perspective, but I would argue it feels more like 2005's often slept-on Cold Fear more than anything, mostly due to the fact that you can actually move the camera without moving your character. Only when you're aiming a weapon does it veer into Capcom's third-person Resident Evil shooter lane. Outside of the spiritual inspirations for its gameplay though, I would say ZBS feels pretty damn close to fellow PS2 horror shooter Extermination when it comes to story and setting. At the start of the game, we're not really told very much, just that we're in Antarctica, there's been some kind of an emergency, and we're in the shoes of a man so rad he not only wears his sunglasses inside, but he also manages to make a scarf look cool. As we wander around this base, we come across yet another inspiration, as there's not a chance in hell this game's enemies weren't inspired by the Sega Saturn's own Resident Evil clone, Deep Fear. After coming across a research scientist who isn't suddenly sprouting new appendages, our man Axel learns that this base was built at the crash site of a meteor, and its purpose is to experiment on a subject they found in the area that appears to be some kind of a virus, but is actually a hive-minded organism. As we catch up on some world-building written logs, we discovered that someone was pushing for results, which led to sloppy work and eventually an outbreak. At the moment, the only thing we know for sure is that this stuff could decimate the planet if it were to get out, and it prefers cold temperatures, which suggests the opposite might kill it. So our goal is to trek around the research base, overriding generators so they go into overdrive, hopefully killing the alien substance. In terms of gameplay, I'd say things do tend to teeter-totter on the edge of jank, but luckily it's the kind of jank that doesn't get in the way of enjoying the game, annoying though it may be. I mean, there's nothing here that breaks the shooting or the difficulty, mostly just awkward hitboxes that, more often than I would like, lead to bullets traveling straight through bad guys with zero damage. At first, you start out with a pistol with no real reticle, which is absolutely no fun, but eventually you're introduced to these mod discs that can be slotted into what I assume are computers at save points and allow you to mess around with accessories for your arsenal. The first one you get is the expected laser sight for your sidearm, and I found that depending on the distance or angle of your shot, it actually indicates a little high compared to where your bullet's actually going to go. These rat things here in particular were almost impossible to hit until I figured out I needed to aim a bit behind them to score a kill. Aside from that, there were a few of the kind of bugs you might expect with a low to no budget indie game. Things like action indicators staying around long after you've left the thing they're trying to get you to interact with, leading to these far-off specks of font visible even when you go down several floors. Then there's a pretty interesting glitch that has enemies locking up and staying put if you get them too close to a door that's closing. Like I said before, it's nothing game-breaking, but just the kind of stuff that makes for a good laugh and the occasional cheap hit. And on that note, the game gives you a dodge roll which genuinely comes in handy not just in tight-spaced combat, but also when you're doing your best to avoid a fight so you can conserve ammo. You know, interestingly, I started off my experience with Zero Below the Sun by playing its demo and figuring that would be enough to get an idea for whether or not I'd recommend it, but I ended up liking it so much that I bought the full game and started playing through that. And I'm really happy that I did, because the finished product is not only a little prettier in ways only a dork like me would notice, but it's also much more harsh on your limited resources. Even though I had acquired a nice arsenal of guns throughout the game, I kept running out of ammo for one and being forced to switch to another, which is a very nice thing to see in a game donning the cloak of survival horror. On that note, I'm glad to say there are puzzles to solve here, the mechanical ones and the ones that'll require you to pay attention to both your environment and the notes you're reading. It's all surprisingly competent for a game that, for a game that looks like this. Which, by the way, is another positive as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I may give lip service to the idea that the low-poly PS1 era look is a little old hat at this point, but you really have to respect a team for sticking to the aesthetic this well. With the awkward shape of the character models and the low-detail textures, I could be tricked into believing this was some kind of an unreleased demo for a PS1 title forced to run in widescreen. And say what you will, but you're just not going to convince me that there's anything in this world better looking than 16:9 dithering. I do have a few complaints in that department though. Like I often bitch and moan about, the developer of ZBS, despite creating a very accurate and sharp PS1 look, still thought it would be a good idea to include really high-res assets like weapon icons, fonts, and the save menu. I'm really asking here, am I crazy for wishing they kept the look consistent? I mean, this stuff just clashes way too hard for me, and even when they do decide to go with low-resolution assets for the game's font, it has scaling errors and some kind of bilinear filter. Now, to be fair, there might be a chance this was intentional. Like maybe the developer was chasing a PS1 by way of sloppy emulation kind of approach, but you couldn't have just used a sprite sheet and the nearest neighbor scale. I'm not trying to sound like I'm yelling at these guys specifically, but this is an issue I see all over the place in these low-poly PS1 adjacent games, and it seems so obviously wrong every time I see it. That being said though, I still think this game looks great. It sticks to the kind of limitations you actually might see on mid-90s 3D gaming hardware, and since that's when I grew up, I'm never going to be able to see that approach as anything but insanely cool, especially when it's pulled off this well. Although it would be nice if someone would tell indie devs that they don't need to crank the affine texture warping dial all the way to 11 to get this point across. As I'm writing this, I put a few hours into Zero Below the Sun, including my time with the demo, and it's so fun that I'm probably going to end up beating it before I release this video. I mean, sure, sometimes my main character looks like he's running around with a freshly pooped diaper, and the faces might have GoldenEye syndrome, but it's a very satisfying mix of retro visual nostalgia and familiar survival horror game design. The setting isn't exactly what I would call original, but it's still cool as hell. Pun intended. And sometimes you can wound enemies enough that you just need to run away and let them bleed out. Add that together with the kind of soundtrack you would expect from a worn VHS copy of an 80s slasher flick, and you've got something that plays and works much better than its presentation might initially have you thinking. I think Zero Below the Sun's regular price came out to $10 or $12, and I would say that's more than a good enough deal for me to give it a really stern recommendation. Definitely check this one out.
God, did you run over an animal?
Let me go check.
While it is a bit of a bad habit, I do tend to judge books by their cover when deciding to include new survival horror projects in these videos. Something you think I would have stopped doing by now, as I'm so often surprised by what people can accomplish with not much more than a cursory knowledge of game development and a love for this genre. I say all this because I can admit that The Hotel by Ilpala didn't exactly give me the best vibes when checking out its Steam page. I can't really say what it is. I mean, I did end up buying the full game, but maybe it was a lack of any flashy, eye-catching logos or game art, but whatever the culprit, I can fully admit I was way off base there. When first booting the game up, you can't even take part in the main campaign until you've completed this tutorial that'll give you the basics on survival horror gameplay. Something I think is actually really great for newcomers, but maybe it should be optional for those of us who already know this style inside and out. When the game proper starts up, though, I was met with something you don't really see too often in these indie survival horror titles: a pre-rendered cutscene. Now, it's obviously just a pre-render of in-engine assets, but for whatever reason, you really don't see a lot of developers doing this in the scene. Something that's actually made all the more impressive when you take into account that this project was a one-man affair. Anyways, the story starts with our main character hoofing it with a few zombies in tow until he reaches a phone and threatens to kill somebody, which is a relatively normal weeknight for a Floridian, honestly.
I'm coming to kill you.
Then we're taken to the true beginning of the story, where our main character and his girlfriend are enjoying their experience as some kind of hotel reviewers. A career I didn't really know existed, but sounds plausible enough, right? Our female companion says she's tired of all the hustle and bustle of the luxury hotels they've been staying at, so they instead book some time at a more remote location. On the way there, they smear a marginalized member of the living impaired, but since they can't seem to find any evidence of it actually happening, they go about their business and just arrive at the hotel like everything's fine. And they're not even there for 5 minutes before the woman who greeted them puts the boots to our guy Alex.
What are you doing?
Don't resist. It's worse.
When he wakes up, it turns into a Saw sort of scenario where she set the hotel up as a giant puzzle box and wants to watch Alex work his way through it in order to find his missing partner. Now, I'll be up front here, I'm not really that big of a fan of this kind of setup, but that's more of a personal thing. I will say though, it does make for a much better explanation for all the locked doors and esoteric puzzle solutions needed to progress. Oh, and he's stuck in there with a ton of zombies. That's probably important to include. And again, I'm really impressed by the kind of hustle this guy's showing by including intermittent story cutscenes here. I don't really know how to describe it other than these pre-renders give the game a nice air of polish, sort of like it's a title with a much larger budget than it actually has. Moving beyond that though, we've got what I would call a very strict adherence to the original Resident Evil style of survival horror, which means tank controls, a limited inventory, item management, universal storage lockers, and of course quick turns and static camera angles. And if you guys know me, you're gonna know that besides a chainsaw, this is one of the quickest and most efficient ways to my heart. I will say though, there is something slightly off with the movement. It kind of feels like my inputs stick. Like when I take my thumb off of a direction, Alex will keep turning or running in that way for a few more steps, which can make navigation a little more unreliable than I'd normally like. Aside from that though, combat feels really familiar, and I have to say the takedown animations for when you break a zombie grab are actually really cool. Yeah, I don't think anyone's ever going to be able to convince me that RE2 wouldn't have been a much improved game if Leon was able to clinch a zombie up and deliver a few hard knees to his forehead. Although to be fair, headbutting a member of The Walking Dead who can turn people with bites might not be the best move to pull, but that's just me. Exploration, on the other hand, seems to be where the hotel really shines. The environment does a great job of slowly revealing itself through key hunting and puzzle solving. I did kind of have an issue early on not knowing that this power cable was actually meant for this computer in the office, but looking back at my footage, that was my fault as I mashed through an examination that told me exactly that. Really though, I found myself most impressed by the layout of rooms and how organic it felt to come across an item and almost immediately be able to recall where you saw some kind of thing you could use it on. Some of the puzzles did require a little more outside-the-box thinking than I'm typically used to, but that just meant I felt more accomplished when I was able to tackle all these challenges without any kind of a guide. If I did have one big criticism, it would be that handgun ammo only stacks to 15 rounds, and you're going to be coming across a lot of that stuff. So if you follow the tenets of survival horror, you're going to have to run back to an item locker kind of often, but like you would expect, as the playfield widens, fast access to one of these things becomes more and more available. As far as the music is concerned, I would say it's really appropriate stuff for the kind of game this is and the kind of setting it has, but nothing really stood out to me as being particularly ear-catching, which isn't to say that it's bad, but that it performs its job just about as well as you could hope. On the presentation side of things, I can say I'm mostly liking what I'm seeing. The game does sort of suffer from the all too common issue in indie games of things being a little too shiny, but Alex looks pretty cool, and I like that as you come across weapons, you'll see them strapped to his body and in holsters even when they're not equipped. I'd say the zombies look relatively good from the mostly far-off distances you'll be viewing them from, and their animations are a step above a lot of similar-looking survival horror games. They move in and out of animations fluidly, with the only exception really being the zombies on the ground spinning in circles to face you, which is funny, so I give it a pass. Overall, I gotta say I'm very impressed with what we have here. The hotel didn't immediately strike me as a high-quality survival horror title, judging purely by its online presence. But when I gave it a chance, it surprised the hell out of me by showcasing a very firm understanding of what makes games like this so good and having a very respectful eye for mostly bug-free game design. That being said, I did run into a few issues. The first and admittedly least important is dialogue that can sound a little stilted.
Are you crazy? What do you want? No!
I'll treat you like the whore you are.
I get the feeling that it was written by someone who doesn't speak English at a native level, and the voice actors probably didn't get a whole lot of direction with their lines, but as I've said a million times on this channel, that is sort of an included hallmark of this genre. Beyond that, after dying for the first time, my controller's input stopped being read and I had to restart the game to fix it. Once I did that, I attempted to skip a cutscene I had already seen, but that locked the game up, requiring yet another restart. I'd say both of these issues don't exactly impact the overall experience all that negatively, and with any kind of luck, Opala might see this segment and have this fixed before any of you guys get a chance to encounter it. Oh, and there's no real reason to mention this, but you really have to give it up to this guy for including a scene this cool. Is it believable that a hotel reviewer would possess the skill to backflip off a wall and accurately shoot while doing so? Absolutely not. Is it badass as hell? Without a single doubt. If you guys get a chance to check it out, I'd say the hotel is more than worth dropping a 20 on. It offers up a very familiar Resident Evil-like experience with a few additions to the formula that feel very much appropriate to the genre. And again, a guy backflipping off of a wall and shooting stuff.
Oh, fuck! He's already dead?
Besides, the vision's not the same.
Oh, this isn't like that time in Betuta, is it?
No. Yeah, nah, of course not.
But what about all those murders on the telly?
Just trying to sell more papers.
What if someone crazy comes to kill us?
I want to start this one off with some praise. I genuinely think this project has potential. Normally, I don't get into joke games, but Loggerhead by Affordable Cat actually got a few laughs out of me. I will admit that as an American, I am sort of genetically programmed to find the Australian accent inherently funny, so that might be accounting for a lot, but there's some good humor in here. In that same vein, I normally don't enjoy the whole damaged VHS aesthetic, and I'll admit I'm not the biggest fan of the constant bad tracking static on the bottom of the screen, but the game honestly does a pretty good job at the whole 80s horror look, and the soundtrack absolutely slaps. I'll also say that these are some damn fine fixed camera angles, and I love that the camera bobs and moves kind of like someone's actually holding it. And finally, big shout out for the posters of Jack Carlson all over the place. Rest in peace, sweet prince. May you forever dine on succulent Chinese meals.
Get your hand off my penis!
Now, as you may imagine, I'm front-loading all of this praise because, with all due respect to the nice person who gave me a key to this game, outside of those points, I think this demo just barely counts as a working video game. At first, I tried using a controller, but only the analog stick was supported, which feels terrible with tank controls and even worse with Loggerhead's tank controls, so eventually I switched to a mouse and keyboard, which is miles better by comparison. If you do plan on playing with a controller though, be prepared for some of the most odd button mapping imaginable, as you'll be hitting X on a PS5 controller to examine or pick items up, and square to confirm menu selections. So for example, to pick up this gun, I need to hit X to open up a prompt and square to confirm it, which really messes my brain up. Regardless of your control option though, you're not going to have a quick turn, and I can assure you it is sorely needed here. I'd say the combat is okay enough for what it is, but shooting feels really nasty because it's so damn easy to miss enemies, and the camera angles don't exactly help with that issue. And speaking of which, early on I found out that the game's enemies can't actually be killed, only downed for less than, I don't know, maybe 10 or 20 seconds, which makes the idea of giving me a revolver and a shotgun with limited ammo kind of strange. I mean, do you or don't you want me engaging in combat here? Even stranger than that is the fact that I can be attacked during door transitions or when menu elements are on screen, both being times that I have no control over my character. Then there's the hilarity of reloading in the menu, then exiting to find your character gliding through the environment until that animation is finished. Oh, and it's never a good sign when item pickup prompts can overlap other 2D assets like text files, and that's compounded by those prompts sticking around way too long. I will admit though, the game started to win me back when I got in my car and it gave me the chance to run these monsters over as I sped away, and the end of the demo is actually really cool, although the effect is somewhat stifled by this physics glitch happening just before the credits roll. Honestly, the entire Australian 80s slasher flick premise works really well for me on paper, and there is evidence here that the developers understand how to make it work as a theme, but on the technical side of things, Loggerhead is just an absolute mess. I genuinely hope that there's some serious work being done under the hood as I speak these words, because it would really be killer to see a finished version of this game that feels, well, finished. As of right now, though, it's more like a series of bugs, some funny and most not, that you have to suffer through while glimpsing the idea of a good video game just off in the distance. Well guys, we have officially closed the book on yet another collection of modern Resident Evil clones. Today's list is probably the most polarized I've ever come across, as these are some of the most and least polished titles I've played since starting this whole thing. Hopefully a few of you found something here that you never heard of before, but if not, I wouldn't worry too much. The amount of high-quality new survival horror titles in the works is showing no signs of slowing down anytime soon, so expect another video jam-packed with killer stuff very soon. But until then, as usual, I'm Jared.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
And this is Avalanche Reviews. Hey people, thank you very much for sticking around. I'm hoping it was my entertaining style that kept you here and not my dashing good looks, but either way I'll have links to my support platforms in the description. If you do want more videos like this, be the change you want to see in the world and join up. I don't really know what else I could say here, so I guess stay awesome and keep up that great work I'm sure you're all doing. Peace out.